So what we need to look at is the balance of power, which constantly shifts and adjusts. How is that balance of power evolving? Is the balance of power going to be maintained in favor of the democracies? Or is the balance of power going to shift in favor of dictatorships like China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and so on? And this is the problem of fighting terrorism. That is a very difficult task. And it is one where often these terrorist organizations have the tremendous advantage of publicity, particularly in the social media. And no one has had more of an advantage than Hamas with the great help of the United Nations.
I am Pocho Salcedo. Welcome to the viewers and TV stations across Latin America and to those joining us from coast to coast in the continental United States and in Hawaii via broadcast and cable networks. From our studio in New York, we are ready to decode the stories that shape our world. This is not just the news, this is the DNA of the news. In recent years, the world has witnessed a profound transformation in the landscape of foreign policy and geopolitics, reshaping dynamics once thought unchangeable. Events that have gained unprecedented momentum include Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the ongoing Israeli, Hamas, and Palestinian conflict, the U.S. bombing of Iran's nuclear facilities, the strategic deployment of U.S. naval assets of Venezuela, and the realignment in general of global commerce through revised U.S. tariffs. These developments mark a significant shift in international relations. To shed light on the reasons and mechanisms driving this evolving landscape and the interconnection among them, we're honored to welcome a world-class expert in international relations to explain what these events signify and why they're unfolding now. Professor Aurel Braun, welcome to the DNA of the news.
Thank you very much.
Aurel Braun is Professor of International Relations and Political Science at the University of Toronto. He is also an associate of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. Besides, is a research associate of the Center for International Studies at the University of Toronto. Professor Braun has published extensively on communist affairs and strategic studies with a special focus on the problems of the transformation of the socialist systems in the former Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe. He is the author and editor/contributor of several books. Fields of study: international relations and comparative politics.
Well, let's go right to the deep end of the pool. Give us your assessment of what you see and the interconnection going on in world affairs over the last couple of years.
We see, in the case of the United States, a president who has declared that he wants to make America great again. So we see tariffs, we see more of an isolationist policy, and that is also, in a way, an attempt to reshape international relations. But at the same time, we are seeing a very major move on the part of China, with the help of Russia, to try to change the global order. And that is also profoundly significant. And so it is not a matter of conspiracy, but it's a matter of interconnectivity. And these larger factors are the ones that set the parameters, that in that way provide a context for all the regional and other disputes. It's not that they absolutely determine them, but I think we can better understand what is happening at the local level or in some bilateral dispute. We keep in mind that big picture.
Thank you very much. Let's start with some of the major events that have happened over the last few years. Russia and Ukraine war began with Russia in 2014, annexation of Crimea, and escalated in 2022 invasion driven by Putin's aim to reassert Russian influence and counter NATO expansion. Tell us a little bit why that happened in 2014 and where we are now.
Russia felt that it was in a sense, given a free pass to take certain steps. They tested the grounds back in 2008 when they invaded part of Georgia. And the reaction at that time was minimal. There were some sanctions proposed, but at the same time, the Europeans basically were so dependent on Russian energy that you see in 2014 the heads of major oil companies like Total in France or the top Italian company, energy company, flying to Moscow in 2014, saying to Vladimir Putin, it's going to be business as usual. So Vladimir Putin worked at the belief, beginning 2008, reinforced in 2014, that he did not have to pay a significant price for gaining these external victories, which would boost his domestic standing. He had a lot of opposition domestically. The social contract internally was beginning to unravel. These external victories would divert attention away of the population from that. We also need to understand how the United Nations failed in the most massive way. In 2014, the United Nations failed in the same way as the League of Nations had failed to stand up to Mussolini. The League of Nations never recovered. The United Nations is still around. It's still spending vast amounts of money, and yet it has zero effect, basically, on its central theme of preserving peace and security. So Russia knew that in 2014, the United Nations was going to do nothing, and they had hoped that this would be also the reaction of the Europeans and the reaction of the United States. And President Biden at that time was warning Russia not to invade, but he was telling Russia, well, if you do invade, we are going to conduct a guerrilla warfare. Not that we are going to oppose you, not that we're going to help Ukraine, because the expectation was that Ukraine was going to collapse. And this is what Vladimir Putin did not count on. And now, almost 4 years later, for a duration that is somewhat similar to that of the Second World War, where Russia played a seminal role in winning that, Russia is still fighting. It is gaining some ground at a horrible cost. Ukraine hasn't won, but it hasn't lost. So in a sense, you have a very bloody standstill with huge losses on both sides, tremendous miscalculations, a failure of the international system. And then you see Mr. Trump coming in, who further gives hope to Vladimir Putin that somehow the United States, pursuing a policy of isolationism, will abandon Ukraine.
But given Russia's military setbacks and Ukraine's reliance on Western support, what is the most likely outcome of the conflict in the next year or so? And we have peace talks that are stalling.
It's an important question because we have had many occasions where Mr. Trump said that he was disillusioned with Vladimir Putin, that he was fed up with being tapped along. But the problem is that he hasn't really learned. Time and again, he will have a meeting by phone or even in person with Mr. Putin and get nothing really in return except give Vladimir Putin more legitimacy. So at the moment, what we have is a situation where the United States has decided that it is willing to supply weapons to the Europeans if the Europeans pay for it, such weapons to be transferred over to Ukraine. That is positive for Ukraine. The European countries have woken up to the fact that they have to rely much more on themselves. And the crucial player here is Germany. Not France, but Germany. Germany is the largest economy, and they are going to spend hundreds of billions of dollars, or euros in their case, on rearmament. But it takes time. It takes time to scale up. So the next 6 months to a year is really crucial. United States continues or has to continue to provide intelligence. It has to provide logistics. It has to provide weapons, even if the Europeans pay for it, until the Europeans can begin to produce more. And the Ukrainians are beginning to produce many more weapons, but they need funds. So Mr. Putin thinks that time is on his side. What is essential to signal to him is that time is not on his side. And this is where Mr. Trump has complicated matters. He has given Vladimir Putin new hope, and the Europeans are only beginning to step up right now, and not all of them. No, the Italians, for example, said we will only send troops if it's approved by the United Nations. Can you imagine that? Approved by the United Nations, the Security Council, Russia has a veto. It's like saying, we are going to provide troops, forgive the expression, when hell freezes over.
Yeah. Well, I couldn't agree with you more on that. But let's jump to another hotspot. There are many that we're dealing with. The Israeli-Hamas conflict reignited by Hamas's October 7, 2023 attack. And we had a very intense Israeli-Palestinian occupation. What are the factors that are being taking place since October? The relationship between the United States and Israel has improved. Iran is not as strong as it was before, and they were backing Hamas. Where do you think this is going?
It is, to say the least, an extremely complex situation. And in a sense, perhaps they might have to divide the military strategic elements from the public relations and the perceptual elements.
Okay.
And it is important to go back to that day on October 7 because democracies tend to have a short memory. And this is just a general feature of democracies because we are preoccupied with a variety of domestic issues. And just days after that horrific massacre, where Hamas basically engaged in extermination and attempted genocide, 5 of the most important democracies met and they said that Hamas must be defeated, that what Hamas did cannot be viewed as legitimate, that Hamas, very importantly, that Hamas was not only a tragedy for Israelis, but Hamas did nothing for the Palestinian people except bring about bloodshed and terror, and they must be removed. Now, countries will pay lip service to that and say, yes, Hamas should be removed, but they do not provide any kind of roadmap. And Hamas is a terrorist organization. And terrorist organizations don't function the same way as regular armies. To remove them, you have to remove them whole cloth. And that is a very painful process. And Hamas's public relations, helped by the United Nations greatly, has been brilliant. And they have been able to convey on campuses and in the media, again, helped by the United Nations, that they are somehow the victims. They have used their own population the way they had before, and it makes it very difficult. And this is the problem of fighting terrorism. That is a very difficult task, and it is one where often these terrorist organizations have the tremendous advantage of publicity, particularly in the social media, and no one has had more of an advantage than Hamas with the great help of the United Nations.
Very quickly, what do you think of those accusations against Israel that they are engaged in genocide in Palestine?
You have to look at what genocide is, and genocide is about intent. And so you have to ask yourself, this is an armed force in Israel that could go in and take out the leadership of the military in Iran, and just took out, decapitated some of the leadership in the case of Yemen. They went into Syria, and they were able to basically disarm that government. They went against Hezbollah. Now, a military force that has that much power, if they wanted to engage in genocide, does anyone seriously believe that there would be any Palestinians left in Gaza? Does anybody think these would be the casualty figures? And any closer examination of the figures of the ratio of civilians to losses of people who were militants, that ratio, according to serious studies, is one of the lowest in warfare. Now, that doesn't come across because when you see the figures coming out from Hamas, which are then adopted by the United Nations, it is that they are losing children. 18-year-olds are children, not people who may be armed, but they're children. Or you have a situation where you had a high-ranking official of the United Nations said that in 48 hours, 14,000 children are going to die of starvation. The United Nations had to walk that back, but the headline was in 48 hours, 14,000 children would die. Page 16 said, well, no, this was a miscalculation and it was misinformation. So this is one of the key problems faced by any country, any state that is confronted with a body such as Hamas that has not only perpetrated these horrific massacres, but stated very clearly that given an opportunity, they would do it over and over again. So what every country, every leader should ask themselves, every sentient individual should ask themselves, what would they do if their country faced that kind of problem? What would Canadians do if we had, compared to our population, something like 20,000 people killed? What would the Americans do if they would have not a 9/11, but compared to the population, they would have, 30 times 9/11? What would be the reaction? And this is the problem.
Well, thank you very much. And to our audience, we're just starting. We'll be right back. We're taking a short break, and we're coming with more key issues happening in international relations today. And we are back with Professor Aurel Braun from Toronto, Canada. Professor Braun, after the midnight hammer, so-called midnight hammer, strikes on the Iranian infrastructure, nuclear infrastructure, what do you think is the current status of Iran's nuclear capabilities and regional influence?
There are various schools of thought, and they range from a damage that would be several months to several years or even longer. And the short answer is we do not know absolutely for sure. But again, looking at the larger context, what we do understand is that the Iranian regime, which is the principal supporter of terrorism around the world, and not only in the Middle East, they also support terrorism in parts of Latin America. The Iranian regime felt itself to be extremely confident. It had all sorts of proxies, whether it was Hezbollah, whether it was Hamas, whether it was the Houthis. They had very sophisticated defense systems from Russia that they bought, the S-300. And so what was demonstrated was that Iran, the regime, is vulnerable, that the nuclear program that they were pursuing was not one for medical purposes, that this was a program that was indeed intended to acquire nuclear weapons, and that they were not able to defend that program. Was it obliterated entirely the way President Trump claims? It's probably doubtful. Was it very severely damaged? It seems, according to the Israelis and many other intelligence services, that it was. But the main element in this is what impact it will have on the regime in the longer term, because it's about the credibility of that regime. A regime that claimed to be omniscient because of their fanaticism and because of their claim that they're doing God's work, that claimed to be omnipotent, proved to be extremely vulnerable. In the case of dictatorship, vulnerability is very destabilizing in the longer term.
Thank you very much. In 2025, the U.S. tariffs have reached historic heights, disrupting global supply, increasing inflation. What do you think is its impact on the global markets, on international relations? How is this going to impact in the years to come?
Let's again look at the big picture, because Donald Trump came to the conclusion that the United States was being taken advantage of, that China was rising, that he had to sort of reset the strategic balance. The United States needs to be stronger. It needed to get better at trade, produce, manufacture more domestically. So let's give him the benefit of the doubt for the time being, because indeed China with the Belt and Road Initiative is not a peaceful initiative entirely. It's very aggressive, and Mr. Xi Jinping has his own agenda. But even if you attribute the best intentions to the United States, the execution has been absolutely terrible. The execution has been one that was governed often by Mr. Trump's whims, personal kind of relations, whether he had a good relationship or bad relationship with a particular leader. And he used tariffs as a blunt instrument rather than as a surgical instrument to say, let's rebalance trade. Let's have the United States be able to manufacture more, because if you're a superpower, you also have to be able to manufacture things like warships and tanks and the computers, since you cannot just depend on a far-off supply chain. But it takes time, and using a blunt instrument, often he went after close friends, whether it was Mexico, or it was Canada, or India, and therefore the relationship with friends that could have helped the United States, particularly in its competition with China, that relationship has been damaged. And this is where Mr. Trump is not really thinking strategically. Because if you go with the original premise that he wanted to make sure that the United States was in a better position to compete with China, in a better position to remain the dominant superpower, you should not gratuitously alienate your friends.
Correct. But that has happened, and as recently we have seen right in China, Xi Jinping welcoming the Prime Minister of India, Vladimir Putin, the supreme leader from North Korea, and Iran. So it almost like he created that response from China.
China was going to compete at any rate because the leadership of China, it's a communist country. We must not forget that. And they had designs on Taiwan, and they want to dominate the area. And they are trying to control exploration in the South China Sea. So they had disputes with Vietnam. They had disputes with the Philippines. But it has been accentuated, these disputes, with Donald Trump. And countries such as India, which do not have a natural relationship with China. They have major border disputes. China has grabbed Indian territory, something equivalent to twice the size of Belgium over the past several years. And those border disputes are not resolved. And in fact, when Mr. Modi was in China, Xi Jinping said, let's have good relations and not hinge those relations on border disputes. And Mr. Modi said, well, wait a second, those disputes are very, very important. So one can see that this is not a natural alliance. But Mr. Trump, in a sense, by having 50% tariffs on India, by claiming that he's the one who settled this brief conflict between Pakistan and India, humiliating the Indian leader, that alienated Mr. Modi. So this is why you see at the Shanghai Cooperative Organization, you see the participation of Modi. Hopefully will not last, because India is the largest democracy and its goals are not really compatible with those of China, with those of Iran, with those of Russia, with those of North Korea, which are all dictatorships. And so these countries want to change the world order to make the world order, in a sense, America-proof. But in reality, what they want to do is they want to make the world order democracy-proof.
In the years 2000s, the relationship between the United States and Venezuela has been very sour, very difficult relationship. But in August of 2025, the U.S. deployed warships and nuclear submarines to the Caribbean, ostensibly to counter drug cartels, prompting President Maduro from Venezuela to denounce as a threat. What is the current state of U.S.-Venezuela relations, and where do you think this is going to go?
We see a tougher stance taken by the United States than the Biden administration had. And I think this is Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who's also the National Security Advisor, who understands that Maduro is not only a threat and a tragedy for the Venezuelan people. He stole the election. Basically, international observers found that the opposition had won massively, But Maduro is also a supporter of terrorism. Maduro is closely tied not just to China, but he's very closely tied to Iran. And you will notice how he has supported Iran and how he has supported China. And so, in a sense, a tougher stance was long overdue given the threat that this regime poses. The question is, are they going about it the right way? One of the ways the Venezuela regime seems to stay in power is that they get a lot of help from Cuba. They give Cuba oil, energy, and Cuba sends security specialists, doctors, and so on. And I don't yet see the United States cutting off that Cuban link. I think that would be very important to follow that regime. So, at one level, taking a tougher stand, a more realistic stance towards Venezuela is beneficial for the sake of democracy, for the benefit of the people of Venezuela, but it has to be done in a multilateral, multidimensional fashion, understanding not only the internal factors that keep Maduro in power, but also the external ties. Money from China, finance and specialist security help from Cuba, and the Cuban connection is especially something that the United States should focus on.
What are the key elements that we should be paying attention to understand in what direction we are going as in world affairs and in all this interconnectivity that you talk about?
There was a tremendous amount of hope 100 years ago by Hugo Grotius, who wrote about international law and how international law, the rule of law, should replace the rule of power. And it was a really noble aspiration. And there were also attempts to do that. But the reality, unfortunately, is that the world is still governed by power. And it is in an anarchical system, it is a balance of power. So what we need to look at is the balance of power, which constantly shifts and adjusts. How is that balance of power evolving? Is the balance of power going to be maintained in favor of the democracies? Or is the balance of power going to shift in favor of dictatorships like China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and so on? And this is the key competition.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me on.